J.R.R. Tolkien, one of the most influential and successful authors of all time, the father of modern fantasy, the man whose book The Hobbit has sold over 100 million copies, and whose book The Lord of the Rings has sold between 150 and 200 million copies, depending on how you want to do the math. It was the best-selling book of the 20th century. And the Middle-earth franchise that came from these books is one of the world's highest valued intellectual properties, with billions of dollars in sales coming from the movies alone. But for Tolkien himself, The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings were just sideshows. They were incidental to his real ambition in life, which was to create, as he called it, a mythology for England. And this ambition drove the work that was his real lifelong obsession, the Silmarillion. Unfortunately for him, when this work was finally released, after a very long ordeal, it was a disaster. If you watch to the end of this video, you're going to see why. You're going to see why Tolkien's publishers weren't so keen on publishing this. And you're going to see how even a story coming from the mind of a genius, let there be no doubt about that, doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be enjoyable. Certainly not for the general public. So make sure you stick around to see what you need to be doing if you want to make sure that your story is, to make sure that you don't go down certain rabbit holes like the Silmarillion. And I hope you enjoy it, and please make sure to hit that like and subscribe button. I would really appreciate it if you do. Let's get started. Tolkien began creating his mythology in World War I. In 1917, he was recovering from a bout of trench fever, which fortunately for him meant that he never saw combat at the front again. And as he was recovering, he started creating the first in a legendarium that was going to span for many thousands of years. This was the first age story of the fall of Gondolin. Also in 1917, he started the story that would become Beren and Luthien, and according to Christopher Tolkien, by 1919, quote, at the latest, the children of Húrin was, quote, in existence. And so slowly, the core of the Silmarillion began to take shape. Tolkien originally called these stories the Book of Lost Tales, which became the first 2 volumes of the history of Middle-earth. According to Christopher, there were 14 stories completed in these early days, which really shows you how enthusiastic Tolkien was for this work. It also makes me a little jealous, actually, because I don't think I would have the stamina to do that, to create 14 stories in only a few years, because these stories were pretty long and substantial. I don't think I'd have the stamina to do that. Writing fiction is much more challenging than writing nonfiction. If you give me an essay or you give me a script for the military show, and it's about 3,500 words or so, I could have that done in a few hours. But to do 3,500 words of fiction, that would take me quite a bit longer. For example, the first novelette that I've written in my cyberpunk universe, and I've tried to get published in some of the magazines, albeit without success so far, but I'm still trying. That took me weeks to do, and that was a little over 11,000 words, more or less. So you can see by these comments of Christopher's how much passion his father had for this work. But of the 14 stories, 3 stood out, and I'm going to read a quote from Christopher about this. It seems questionable, from my father's own words, that if he could achieve final and finished narratives on the scale he desired, he saw 3 great tales of the elder days as works sufficiently complete in themselves as not to demand knowledge of the great body of legend known as the Silmarillion. And yes, if you look at these 3 stories, the great tales, of all the parts of the Silmarillion, these are the 3 that read most like proper stories. What I mean by this is they have recognizable protagonists, story questions that lead to a quest, internal flaws that the protagonists have to deal with to succeed in their quest, external obstacles, proper climaxes, and proper conclusions, whether the story question will be answered with a yes or a no. And as Christopher notes, they're self-contained. You don't need to have any other knowledge of Tolkien to enjoy these in their own right. You can read them and you will enjoy them probably. And honestly, I think this might have been a mistake I made with my novelette, because even though I had the example of the Silmarillion in the back of my mind as I was writing this, it still takes place pretty late in my series timeline, so inevitably I was calling on earlier mythology, if you will. Let's aim high, right? And maybe that disrupted the flow in some way. Maybe it made it too dependent. I don't know. I'm still shopping it around. You can be the judge of it, because either way, it's eventually going to be on my Patreon page, which you should check out because I have a lot of other good stuff on there too. So anyway, it's no coincidence that these three great tales of Middle-earth were the ones that were eventually published as their own novels, albeit long after Tolkien's death. So why weren't any of these stories, even the three great tales, why weren't they published until after Tolkien's death? To find the answer to that question, we first need to look into the publication history of the novels that were released in his own lifetime, The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. So, in the early days, in the 1920s, Tolkien continued to slowly create and revise his mythology, but he didn't do much else with it in these years, which is, I think, something all writers can relate to, having a bunch of work that we don't do anything with for a long time, right? But the turning point in his career came when he wrote the words, "In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit." This isn't the place to go over The Hobbit's publication history, but we all know that when it was released, it was a massive hit, a huge phenomenon, and naturally Tolkien's publisher, Stan Unwin of the George Allen and Unwin Company, wanted another book. So now this is where the two men started to disagree, because now that he had success, Tolkien's idea was that he was going to finally be able to publish the mythology that he'd been working on now for 20 years. And it would make sense because while according to him he didn't originally intend for The Hobbit to be connected to the canon in the Silmarillion, he was not successful in this, and in a later letter he wrote, "Its shadow," the Silmarillion, was deep in the later pans of The Hobbit. So in November 1937, he submitted parts of the Silmarillion to the Allen and Unwin Company, but unfortunately for him, one of the publisher's beta readers, a man named Edward Crankshaw, didn't entirely like what he saw. He liked the prose, but he didn't like the poetry, and he especially hated the, quote, eye-splitting Celtic names. This was not what Unwin had in mind. He rejected the Silmarillion and said that the public wanted more about hobbits. In other words, he wanted an explicit sequel to The Hobbit. So that December, Tolkien began work on The Lord of the Rings. It took him 12 years to finish it, but he revealed his true intentions when he finally started to shop the manuscript around. Tolkien wanted to publish The Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion together. Unfortunately for him, he knew this was not going to be an easy sell with Stan Unwin, so his thoughts were starting to turn elsewhere. Specifically, in the autumn of 1949, he struck up a friendship with a man named Milton Waldman, who was a senior editor at Collins, which has since become HarperCollins. The two men, both of them were Catholics, which was very important to Tolkien, and in fact, they were introduced by a Catholic priest by the name of Gervase Matthew, who, like Tolkien, was a professor at the University of Oxford and a member of the Inklings literary group. So they traveled in similar worlds, and this was an important personal connection. And it really matters, knowing that you like the person you're dealing with and that that person likes you and is similar to you. It makes everything easier and more comfortable. The personal and the professional are always intertwined, no matter what anyone else says. So it was natural that Tolkien would be attracted to possibly having Waldman's company publish his newest stories. Tolkien showed Waldman the manuscripts to both The Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion, and much to his relief, Waldman liked both of them. So that was really all he needed, and it was going to finally bring the long-running showdown between him and Stan Unwin to a head, because although the two men had a obviously successful professional relationship, personally they were never particularly close, and Tolkien's resentments of his publisher grew in the years that he had been working on The Lord of the Rings. For example, he was upset that the company had done little to promote a short story called Farmer Giles of Ham, which he published in 1949. And this story is so obscure that even a lot of Tolkien fans haven't heard of it. I didn't even hear of it until I was doing the research for this video, actually. I mean, you could go to the bookstores, and usually in the sci-fi and fantasy section, there's at least one pretty large shelf dedicated to Tolkien. I've seen some really obscure Tolkien works there, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, for example. But I've never seen Farmer Giles of Ham on any of those shelves. The work was basically allowed to fall down a black hole into obscurity, and Tolkien wasn't happy about this. He was also unhappy about the reprints of The Hobbit, which included changes to the manuscript that he didn't intend to publish. So, although he was gracious in his letters about the Silmarillion's initial rejection by George Allen and Unwin Company, his arguments against the reasoning for the publisher's rejection reveal how hurt he really was, and this feeling within him seems to have grown over the years. And this is an understandable feeling, and I think no writer or artist has ever not felt it, because when you pour your heart and soul and energy and imagination into creating something, and it isn't received as well as you had hoped for, and you find that other people don't like it as much as you like your work, it's a harsh thing to deal with. It's a brutal reality, and you might even start to doubt yourself and doubt your talents. So, of course, Tolkien was going to feel that way. But the fact that he had a friend who he shared similarities with that was so enthusiastic about his mythology, this was obviously a welcome development for him. Waldman said to Tolkien that as long as he could finish the Silmarillion, he would be happy to publish it alongside the Lord of the Rings. So Tolkien thinks, great, that's what he wants to do. But there was a problem, because he was still under contract with the George Allen and Unwin Company. So in 1950, in February, he wrote a letter to Stan Unwin, and it is a rather peculiar letter. My work, The Lord of the Rings, has escaped from my control, and I have produced a monster, an immensely long, complex, rather bitter, and very terrifying romance, quite unfit for children, if fit for anybody. And it is not really a sequel to The Hobbit, but to the Silmarillion. My estimate is that it contains, even without certain necessary adjuncts, about 600,000 words. One typist put it higher. I can see only too clearly how impracticable this is, but I am tired. It is off my chest, and I do not feel that I can do anything more about it, beyond a little revision of inaccuracies. Worse still, I feel that it is tied to the Silmarillion. You may perhaps remember about that work, a long legendary of imaginary times in a high style and full of elves of a sort. It was rejected on the advice of your reader many years ago. As far as my memory goes, he allowed to it a kind of Celtic beauty intolerable to Anglo-Saxons in large doses. He was probably perfectly right and just, and you commented that it was a work to be drawn upon rather than published. Unfortunately, I am not an Anglo-Saxon, and though shelved until a year ago, the Silmarillion and all that has refused to be suppressed. It has bubbled up, infiltrated, and probably spoiled everything that even remotely approached Faerie, which I have tried to write since. It was kept out of Farmer Giles with an effort, but stopped the continuation. Its shadow was deep on the later pans of The Hobbit. It has captured The Lord of the Rings, so that has become simply its continuation and completion, requiring the Silmarillion to be fully intelligible without a lot of references and explanations that clutter it in one or two places. Basically what he's saying here is that, Stan Unwin, there are very good reasons for you to reject this. And a couple of weeks later, he wrote to Waldman, thinking that he had succeeded in convincing Unwin to reject it. I have replied to the effect that I see in his, Unwin's, letter his goodwill, but also perceive his opinion that this mass of stuff is not suitable for ordinary publication and requires endowment. I had in my letter made a strong point that the Silmarillion, etc., and the Lord of the Rings went together, as one long saga of the jewels and the rings, and that I was resolved to treat them as one thing, however they might formally be issued. I noted that the mass naturally divides only between the Silmarillion and the Lord, each about 600,000 words, but that the latter is not divisible except into artificial fragments. I added that I shall not be surprised if he declines to become involved in this monstrous saga, and that now it is off my chest, I am very willing to turn out something simpler and shorter, and even actually juvenile, for him soon. There, at the moment, the matter waits. I profoundly hope that he will let go without demanding the MS manuscript. But not so fast. Unwin disagreed with Tolkien's assessment, and he sent the manuscript to the same person who first read and approved The Hobbit, his son Rayner, who was then a child but had since grown up. And Rayner's high opinion convinced his father that children should be the primary target audience for The Hobbit, even though, as we know now, a lot of adults enjoyed it too. So Rayner looked at The Lord of the Rings, and much as he had The Hobbit, he loved it. But he didn't like the Silmarillion. So now we have a very long, complicated saga that ensues. Stan Unwin knew that he had something with The Lord of the Rings, that it was worth publishing, but he simply would not have the Silmarillion. And Tolkien's insistence that the two be published together reached the point that Unwin had no choice but to decline. So, yes, Unwin was so dead set against publishing the Silmarillion that he was willing to turn down the manuscript of what became the best-selling book of the entire 20th century. That's how much he hated it. But for Tolkien, this was a win, because now he got to go with his friend Waldman, the man who would support his artistic vision in creating this mythology for England, right? Unfortunately, this is not where the story ends, because Waldman was not the only one making these important decisions. By late 1951, the people at Collins, including William Collins, were becoming increasingly worried that these two books were too long, especially if they were going to be published together. And at this time, Tolkien wrote a letter of over 10,000 words arguing that The Lord of the Rings was inseparable from the Silmarillion. They had to be published together. And this letter is indeed an interesting look at Tolkien's views on his own mythology. It is letter 131, and I've included it in the bibliography on the script for this video, which you can get on my Patreon page. So it's interesting, but for a publisher, not so interesting. Collins was concerned even just about the length of The Lord of the Rings, let alone publishing both of these books together. The publisher wanted him to do some cutting, bottom line. So it's now 1952. It's been over 2 years since the manuscript of The Lord of the Rings was finished, and yet no publication yet in sight. And Tolkien now is kind of in a world of trouble. Fortunately for him, Rayner reached out to him in late 1951, and Tolkien took the invitation to resume their correspondence. He even had to admit that he behaved a little badly. When I have a moment to turn round, I will collect the Silmarillion fragments in process of completion, or rather the original outline, which is more or less complete, and you can read it. My difficulty is, of course, that owing to the expense of typing and the lack of time to do my own, I typed nearly all of The Lord of the Rings. I have no spare copies to let out. But what about The Lord of the Rings? Can anything be done about that to unlock the gates I slammed myself? Even someone as mighty as J.R.R. Tolkien has to eat some humble pie every once in a while. So Rayner was now officially working under his father in the company, and he, of course, was positive. Of course, I'll have The Lord of the Rings. Of course, give it to me. So Rayner made some suggestions at this time that he would look at the Silmarillion a little later, but conveniently, only The Lord of the Rings was published at long last in 1954. And of course, as we all know, it was an instant smash. But for Tolkien, this was really just a pit stop. He welcomed the success and got back to work on the Silmarillion, hoping that he would be able to publish it in his lifetime. And he held on to that hope until 1972. Only then, when his health was failing him, did he finally admit that it wasn't going to happen. He passed on the task to his son Christopher and died the following year. So Tolkien died as the best-selling author of the 20th century, but I can only imagine that he felt a little unfulfilled in the end, because the thing that he really wanted to publish, this mythology that he'd been trying so hard to bring into the world since he was in his 20s, that was something that eluded him to the end for all his other accomplishments. And I'm sure it hurt him to know that the thing that he clearly considered his greatest work was so comparatively undesired. Fortunately for him, though, he had a good son, and Christopher proved faithful to his father's vision. He was determined to complete his father's task, but coalescing the Silmarillion into a publishable work was a painstaking process, as I'm sure you would imagine. There were so many drafts, not all of them were in good condition. Some of the sources weren't even in the Tolkien family's possession anymore. But fortunately, Christopher had some good help. He had the able assistance of the then 26-year-old Guy Gabriel Kay. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. It might not be the first pronunciation I get wrong in this video. But Guy Gabriel Kay is a writer who later had a distinguished career path ahead of him in his own right. He won the Aurora Award for Best Novel in 1991 with his Tagana. So this was able assistance. The timing was right too. Stan Unwin died in 1968. Rayner, who always had a warmer personal relationship with the Tolkien family, took over the company. And the risk of publication had also been reduced by this time. Printing costs had gone down, but more importantly, J.R.R. Tolkien was now a name that everybody knew. He became so famous in his own lifetime that he had to get his phone number removed from public listings, he had to keep his address a secret, and even then he still had to hire part-time secretaries to go over the flood of mail that he got anyway. So anything with the name Tolkien on it, then as now, was guaranteed to get eyeballs. So all the stars had aligned. and in September 1977, 60 years after it was conceived, the Silmarillion was finally born. But it was an ugly baby. The reviews at the time for the Silmarillion are sometimes funny in just how mean they are. For example, in October 1977, Timothy Foote, writing in Time, says, "Buried in the sprawling narrative are medieval romances, scenes from fairy tales, and fiercer wars that ring with heraldic fury and brighten with the loyalty of warrior to king celebrated in Anglo-Saxon poetry. But there is no single unifying quest, and above all, no band of brothers for the reader to identify with as they struggle across a perilous landscape." What did I say at the start of this video? Some of the reviews were meaner than that. Francis King in the Sunday Telegraph said, "It was an overlong and rather indigestible meal." In a review for the New Republic, L.J. Davis said, "It comes as an enormous letdown to discover that Tolkien spent all those decades laboring over something very much akin to the Book of Mormon. Is anybody following this? I'm not, and I'm writing it down. The book is little more than a weak gloss on Tolkien's infinitely more mature later work, and so it should be read, if at all. Indeed, much of the material is included in the appendices of Lord of the Rings in condensed and more intriguing form. Its publication now, especially when accompanied by such bridled enthusiasm on the part of the industry, is not only questionable, but is bound to lead many of Tolkien's admirers to grave disappointment. Noble intentions do not necessarily produce a noble work. Perhaps the opposite is more often true than otherwise." But I think the most devastating quote that I've read about the Silmarillion from a writer's perspective came from Peter Conrad in his review for the New Statesman. He said that Tolkien couldn't write and lacked imagination. So that's pretty devastating for any writer to hear. Rainer Unwin called the reviews of the Silmarillion at the time the most unfair he'd ever seen in his career, and in fact, it's arguable that the historian and novelist Edmund Fuller predicted the Silmarillion's fate in the early 1960s when he said that because everybody loved The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, an inevitable counter-reaction was coming. But were Rainer and Fuller right about this? Were the reviews unfair and the result of a counter-reaction from Tolkien's earlier success? I honestly don't think that they were, because the Silmarillion is really not that good. The best proof that the Silmarillion was an ugly baby comes in the book sales. It sold over 1 million copies, which any writer would dream of, but by Tolkien's lofty standards, it's not impressive. The mass market appeal for the Silmarillion as its own standalone work, it's really not there. I have no doubt that if the Silmarillion were published as Tolkien hoped it would be as the follow-up to The Hobbit, it would have bombed. Fortunately for him, he had the benefit of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings to rightfully cement his place as one of the most influential authors of all time, and so the Silmarillion sold well just because it had his name on it. If it didn't have his name on it, it wouldn't have sold at all. Now, as I mentioned at the start of the video, the 3 great tales of Middle-earth in the Silmarillion, namely Beren and Luthien, the Children of Húrin, and the Fall of Gondolin, are legitimately good, well-constructed stories. But the rest of the Silmarillion is kind of a mess. It wouldn't have sold well because it is a very hard book to read, and it's not particularly enjoyable either. Now, again, it can be interesting if you want to know more about Tolkien's mythology, but even then, it's really hard to get through. The writing is complicated, and the story isn't told from the point of view of any particular character most of the time, so it's just hard to get into. It's not the kind of book that you can sit down with, put on your lap and keep turning page after page. It's just not like that. As an example, here is a brief passage from the Silmarillion on the origin of the character of Maeglin, who played a very important role in the destruction of Gondolin. It is not said that Aradel, I'm pronouncing that wrong, I know, was wholly unwilling, nor that her life in Nan Elmoth was hateful to her for many years. For though at Eol's command she must shun the sunlight, they wandered far together under the stars or by the light of the sickle moon, or she might fare alone as she would, save that Eol forbade her to seek the sons of Feanor or any others of the Noldor. And Aradel bore Eol a son in the shadows of Nan Elmoth, and in her heart she gave him a name in the forbidden tongue of the Noldor, Lomion, that signifies child of twilight. But his father gave him no name until he was 12 years old. Then he called him Maeglin, which is sharp glance, for he perceived that the eyes of his son were more piercing than his own, and his thought could read the secrets of hearts beyond the mist of words. So you can kind of see what we're dealing with here. But what about this passage about a more dramatic event? It is told that even as Feanor and Fingolfin stood before Manwë, there came the mingling of the lights when both trees were shining, and the silent city of Valmar was filled with a radiance of silver and gold. And in that very hour Melkor and Ungoliant came hastening over the fields of Valinor, as the shadow of a black cloud upon the wind fleets over the sunlit earth. And they came before the green mound Ezelolhar. Then the unlight of Ungoliant rose up even to the roots of the trees, and Melkor sprang up upon the mound, and with his black spear he smote each tree to its core, wounded them deep, and their sap poured forth as it were their blood, and was spilled upon the ground. But Ungoliant sucked it up, and going then from tree to tree, she set her black beak to their wounds, till they were drained, and the poison of death that was in her went into their tissues and withered them, root, branch, and leaf. And they died. And still she thirsted, and going to the wells of Arda she drank them dry. But Ungoliant belched forth black vapors as she drank, and swelled to a shape so vast and hideous that Melkor was afraid. So the great darkness fell upon Valinor. Again here, it's not that the words are badly written. In fact, I think that passage was written very well. But when you look at this, you see that most of the content here is heavy on points of lore and told from an impersonal point of view. It feels distant, doesn't it? And yes, the names can be pretty hard to pronounce, and that matters. In a book called Wired for Story, which I highly recommend to any creative writer out there, the author Lisa Cron distinguishes between a story versus things that happen. A story is designed from beginning to end to answer a single overarching question. Thus, it would seem that when you're writing a story, defining what it's about should be simple, yet it often proves maddeningly elusive. Despite our best intention, the narrative meanders, spending way too much time wandering aimlessly down back roads, so in the end, although a lot of interesting events take place, they don't add up to anything. No question is asked, let alone answered. So this is the Silmarillion's central problem, because even though it technically does have a story question, as all, or rather most of the tales in it add up to whether or not Morgoth would be defeated and the Silmarils recovered, the tales themselves are too disconnected from each other to feel like a real story. In contrast, the Beren and Luthien tale and the Children of Húrin and the Fall of Gondolin, they are well linked within themselves, and they do have recognizable story questions. Will Beren and Luthien get together? Will the Children of Húrin escape their cursed fate? Will Gondolin fall? But most of the rest of the Silmarillion, it's, as one of Tolkien's publishers said, it is obscure. And while the tales themselves are they're valid concepts, that could be crafted into a good story at some later point, they remain basically just concepts. The execution just isn't there. So one of the lessons that I take away from the Silmarillion as a writer is that this book was far more important to Tolkien himself than to his readers. And indeed, this is basically what Unwin was saying to him, because I'd argue that one of the reasons that The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings were such masterpieces is that they have such a rich world history behind them. This kind of world building adds so much depth to the setting and the characterization and the details and everything that they encounter that it aids the illusion that the story is casting. It draws the reader in because, again, there's just so much attention to detail there. So the actions of the characters feel more real, they feel more natural, they feel more organic. The illusion is maintained. And this sort of world building is particularly important for the fantasy and sci-fi genres, because when you're writing a story that takes place in our world of today, or you're writing a historical based story, readers can more or less easily fill in the details from their own knowledge, so they create part of your story's illusion themselves. But on the other hand, if you're writing a story set in a place called Middle Earth, or even if you're writing about the near future, like say 2030 Japan, back when Masamune Shirow started writing The Ghost in the Shell in the late 1980s, you're going to need to flesh out your world more so that readers can get a sense of where they are. And I think that's where the Silmarillion had the greatest impact. It wasn't so important to the reader, but it was hugely important to Tolkien in creating his world. Because he had been in the process of world building for 20 years before he started writing The Hobbit, this gave him a base to draw from when he was telling his real stories. And because of all that detail, the illusion that The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings creates is almost perfect. So the Silmarillion is best seen as source material and not a real story. I think that Tolkien's publishers were right in their hesitation to put it to print. But more personally, I find it very comforting that even a genius like J.R.R. Tolkien wasn't immune from the problems that all writers face. Even he had his share of rejections and frustrations with his work, and even he had his passion projects that he could get lost in that clearly a lot of other people didn't seem to get. So even he had to struggle with other people making demands on his artistic vision. But do you agree with my judgment about the Silmarillion? Be sure to let me know in the comments. Again, thank you for watching all the way to the end of the video. I hope it was enjoyable and educational for you. Please also hit those like and subscribe buttons to help me in my fight against the YouTube algorithm. Truly, I love you all. And if you check out my Patreon page, you can get the script to this video and a whole bunch of other goodies besides, including the admittedly primitive alpha chapters for the first novel in my own Legendarium, my Midnight Crisis cyberpunk series. You'll find a lot more there too. Next week, we're going to be looking at how an otherwise great story can be completely ruined if just one element is wrong. So make sure to stick around for that, because you don't want that to happen to you. Until then, keep writing and keep fighting.